The first time the other people's thoughts came to her, it was as if a radio suddenly tuned into a station no one else could hear. She had been in the elevator with a manager from Xi Construction, a man whose resume boasted of philanthropy and whose mouth was full of polite gossip. She had pressed her palm to the handrail, and his voice, a private thinking, slid into her like a current. So easy. Take the sketches, and they won't even know. Qian will do anything for the right shoe, he thought, which meant betrayals were always for sale. He thought he was clever. He had a bruisable arrogance. Xia Zhiwan's breath caught. For a breathless instant, she doubted her sanity. Then she felt the thought again, a sensation like smelling jasmine in a market. Not someone's speech, but their private articulation, small images, motives, a scent of greed. She had never believed in mind reading. She had believed in observation and memory. But that night, the boundary relaxed, and the world multiplied. Faces became modest book covers, hiding pages that could be read, provided she had the nerve to open them. She learned quickly to steady herself. The power was less a superpower and more an instrument that amplified what she had always been good at, noticing the way a man adjusted his cuff when lying, the quickness with which a woman moved her eyes before a false smile. Now she heard their inner rationales as well. It was intoxicating and dangerous. She swore to use it only when necessary. She could feel the moral edge of that promise like the hammer of a pendulum. One wrong flick, and she would be the betrayer of privacy she despised. Her sister, Xia Zhiwan, moved through the same world in a different light. Where Zhiwan had been quiet and folded inward, Qian had learned the language of assent, coquettish smiles, strategic marriages, a cruelty that wore designer silk like armor. Qian's mind, to Zhiwan's surprise, was noisy and bright with entitlement. I deserve more, it hummed. Why shouldn't I take? She is weak. I am inevitable. There was a man behind Xia Zhiwan assent, Mr. Wang, a predator who shaped his opportunities into assaults. He had the oily charm of someone who believed the world could be bought, and the conscience of a man who never doubted his own value. When Zhiwan first brushed against one of his thoughts in the corridor of the convention center, she felt bile rise. He planned with the casual horror of a tax audit, a methodical outline of who could be coaxed, who could be silenced, who could be made to vanish. There was a line she would not cross. There was a line he had crossed. Her first public humiliation, engineered by Xia Zhiwan and Mr. Wang together, had been surgical. At the gala for a new educational district project, a forged video of Zhiwan accepting a bribe surfaced. The hall echoed with guests' laughter like broken china. The video showed a woman in a dark coat placing an envelope on a table, then smiling to camera with a face similar enough to Zhiwan's to generate just enough plausible doubt. Directors whispered, a conference table dissolved. Chang Hong's name bled into headlines. Their mother's legacy, already mismanaged, slid further. Zhiwan watched the gala from the cheap hotel room, feeling the old shame wrap itself around her like a worn shawl. Yet something in her did not fold this time. Remembering hurt in a way that opened rather than closed her. She would not allow their history to be overwritten by a frame of fabricated pixels. The video would be the first skirmish. If she had been smaller, she would have fled. Instead, she let the anger teach her to plan. She called Zhou Qi. "I want into the company," she said simply, "not to be a figurehead, to run it, to prove the video is fake." He looked at her then with a softness that did not pity. "You know they will stop at nothing," he said. "I know," she answered. "Then we stop them faster." He became, in the months that followed, her shadow and her scaffold. When she applied to the board, it was her that spoke with the calm fury that memory produced. She had sketches folded in her bag, designs their mother had sketched with a trembling hand in the years when business meant hard choices and honest lines. She presented them not as sentimental artifacts, but as intellectual property. The prototypes, the patents in draft, the old invoices showing paid suppliers. She positioned herself not as the wronged daughter, but as the living archive of Chang Hong's legacy. Some on the board laughed, some did not. The Xi family watched from their glass towers with a clinical interest. Xi Zhenting, who carried his smiles like carefully arranged art, had a mind that moved like chess. When he spoke in the narrow conference room, Zhiwan read, beneath his words, a calculation that almost made her laugh with recognition. Useful, but for now. He had allies, a grandmother with an iron throat and the numbers to back any claim. He was a man who could swing a vote or be made to swing it. Zhiwan did what she was best at. She gathered evidence. She reconstructed the paper trail with hands that remembered their mother's order of drawers. She found old letters, receipts hidden in a shoebox, sketches with the exact annotations an engineer friend could corroborate. She also used the small, dangerous gift that had come with memory, mind reading. It was a scalpel. It let her glean a sentence misplaced in someone's confidence. The bank transfer will post Tuesday, and then check accounts. It let her detect the lie in a CEO's famous smile, a hurried worry about an audit. It was not infallible. Thoughts were messy, layered with misdirection, shame, and private fantasies. But it was enough. There were nights, of course, when the power was a curse. In the dim light of a diner, Zhou Qi once sat across from her and found her suddenly silent.
"You hear him?" he asked. "I hear their reasons," she said. "It's like eavesdropping on stove fires, hot, dangerous." "Will it get us what we need?" "It will if we don't become what we fight." He reached across and took her hand. The warmth of his palm steadied the tremor in her fingers. In that small contact, there was a life that had not been planned by her revenge, a life she could choose. She could be ruthless and hollow and win, or she could fight and keep something human inside. She chose the latter because her mother had chosen faith in people over cynicism, and because memory had returned her not only the list of wrongdoers, but the woman she had been before bitterness. Their first major reversal came when Zhiwan intercepted a conversation between Qian and a middleman at a private club. The middleman, a man who trafficked in favors, thought himself invisible. He thought of himself, in the smallest of his private musings, as indispensable and anonymous. When Zhiwan walked past, his thoughts spilled like an open purse. The transfer is done, change the account, bury the ledger. She followed the trail, bank branches, a shell company registered to an LLC that had no employees, and found, tucked inside an old contractor invoice, a stamp in her mother's hand. She did something bold. Against all counsel, she leaked one small truth to Connie, the industry leader who had been dismissive at the gala. Connie, for all her steel, had a taste for fairness when it served her credibility. The evidence, a sequence of sketches matched to invoices, dates that contradicted the video's alleged timeline, sparked Connie's interest. Connie had wing and influence. Her endorsement could not be bought by Mr. Wang's elaborate bribery. Of course, the villain struck back. The simplest twist came from an unexpected ally-turned-traitor, Li Chuan, whom Zhiwan had trusted for his sense of pragmatism. He was clever in ways she had not hoped. A single message sent in a careless hour, an intercepted email that showed her communications with Connie, reached the wrong eyes. Public opinion, fickle as ever, leaned again toward shame. A late-night delivery of a threatening letter to her father's house left her family shaken. Old Xia, who had once believed the family better than its neighbors, retreated into a silence that smelled of disappointment and clotted grief. Then came the worst escalation. One night, after a closed-door meeting at a rented conference space where she had presented the final proof of forged signatures, a van pulled up outside her hotel. Zhiwan, careful but not paranoid, had misjudged the pattern of surveillance. A group of men, led by a notorious fixer tied to Mr. Wang, forced their way into the elevator. There was a shove, a struggle that was more noise than terror, up close but murky, a hand at her throat that felt like the world's absence. She tasted metal and smoke and the fleeting flash of every woman who had ever been told to be smaller.
She remembered the rule she had made when memory returned. If it came to harm, get out. Use the mind reading to find the will and root of the attacker. She opened herself in a tiny way to the nearest mind, the fixers, and heard, not words, but the crude arithmetic of greed and fear. 2 more guards at the door. The fixer was new, reckless. He wanted to impress. He had a wife, maybe, and bills. He had been told a story about what would happen if they succeeded. The story did not take into account the person whose life was a ledger that refused to be balanced in the way they imagined. He faltered when he discovered Zhiwan knew that he feared arrest when police lights flashed. A roar of tires outside made them freeze. Someone had called it in, Zhou Qi. He had been tailing a thread he'd found through the scooter routes and a friend at the hotel's front desk. The men scattered, scrambling into the night, leaving a pocket of silence like a shuttered shop. Zhiwan pressed fingers to her wrist where the bracelet burned and felt a tremor that was not just adrenaline, but an old, bone-deep grief unspooling into a fierce, precise anger. They reported it. They made a police complaint. Mr. Wang's men were implicated. Police photos were taken. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and exhaustion. Zhiwan lay for a while with a blanket over her, and the thought of her mother's hands smoothing the hem of a dress carried her across the ache. She did not want to be a martyr. She wanted to be a strategist who could ensure such men had no purchase on her life or her family's name. The law, flawed and slow, could be a tool. So could public exposure. So could evidence. She learned the hard lesson of revenge. Timing was everything. A rush exposed the seams. She had to be patient until the public coalesced behind truth. That meant building alliances, not burning bridges, and gathering the kind of evidence that would hold when attacked. It meant coaxing Xi Zhenting into a position where his own interests aligned with hers. Xi Zhenting offered, unnervingly, to be an ally. It was at a charity auction where silk scarves cost more than a month's rent for most people that he sat across from Zhiwan and poured his words with the precision of someone who had practiced politeness until it was indistinguishable from truth. "I have a stake in stability," he said, and she felt, through the faintest leak of his thought, a calculation like an engineer's line. If Chonghong falls into Mr. Wang's hands, it pollutes my supply chain. He wanted the board to be composed of people who would not rock his world. He wanted to ensure the district project proceeded with his materials. He wanted something, and she could use that. He wanted to be able to buy a good conscience. "Then help me," she said, and she did not sugarcoat that help would cost him his patience with Chen Chen. He did not look surprised. "I have no particular love for your sister," he said. "She is expendable." Zhiwan's chest tightened. Expendable. It was easy to forget how thin the veneer of civility was when power leaned forward. But she had learned not to trade the right for the expedient. She would use Xie Zhenting's ballot, but she would not allow him to decide who lived or died. There were moments of gentleness between the fierceness. Zhou Qi learned drafts and revisions, not just of resonance arcs and design language, but of moral language. He learned when to be quiet in meetings and when to speak with blunt truth. At night, they sat on the battered scooter and rode through empty streets, the city lights a blur, and she let herself be small in his arms. Memory had returned her the anger. His presence returned her to the fragile joy of being seen without strategy. Romance, for them, grew in the limits,
A hand on a sketch, a cup of late-night noodles, the sharing of a toothbrush in a cramped flat that smelled of lemon and ink. He did not demand that she let down her guard. He only asked that she let him be a witness to who she had been and what she was building. He cheered when a small victory came, a supplier unwilling to be bought back into silence, returning a signed affidavit, an engineer who remembered her mother's meticulous notes, agreeing to testify. But the darkness pushed. Chen Chun struck publicly again, this time with a forged letter that suggested their mother had redistributed funds to a private foundation that did not exist. It was petty and cruel, and, most importantly, poisonous. It aimed at their father's heart. Old Xia, reading the letter, crumpled in a way that made Zhiwan's hands go cold. How could she? Old Xia whispered, a question that hung like a curtain. Shame, it turned out, had more leverage than money. The key to undoing the forgeries, Zhiwan realized, lay not only in documents, but in a person, a former clerk of Changheng who had preserved, like a miser, a quilt of old receipts sewn into a ledger. The clerk had disappeared years ago after a scandal. He lived now in a cinder-block apartment above a noodle shop and drank sunless tea. When Zhiwan found him, he smelled of old paper and regret. He had been bribed once by Mr. Wang and had kept proof of the transaction as a kind of conscience, a receipt he could not throw away because it reminded him of what he'd done. He was afraid to come forward until she said, plainly and without entreaty, "Confess to the court. Tell the truth. I will stand with you." The man's thoughts were a tangle, fear, guilt, a tiny, secret longing for forgiveness. Zhiwan used her abilities sparingly, listening to his interior and shaping her words to give him the courage his mind craved. When he testified, the courtroom smelled of old varnish and sweat and expectation. The forged contracts, the phantom transfers, the shell LLCs, everything unspooled in front of judges, who had been expected to be impressed by Mr. Wang's lawyers. The lawyer for the defendants asked questions with a syrup of menace.
Qian Chan sat with lipstick like armor, and for a moment Zhiwan wondered if vindication would feel as clean as she had imagined. Then came the twist that nearly took them down. Someone leaked a set of emails, old, doctored, and arranged with malicious intent, that suggested a cozy relationship between Zhao Qi and a corporate whistleblower whose motives were ambiguous. The press smelled scandal and pounced. An influencer with 100,000 followers posted a snide thread that turned their gains into a caricature. For a week, their strategy wavered like a boat in a squall. It was the first time Zhiwan felt the fragile infrastructure of public sympathy slip. She had worked so hard to avoid becoming one more victim of internet rumor, and yet here they were, dragged into the mire by a single well-placed leak. It was then she realized the staple of their enemy's strategy: distraction. When people were busy pointing fingers at a romantic entanglement, they were not looking at bank ledgers. When they were outraged over gossip, they were not reading patents. She needed a move that would not only reveal the forgeries, but strip away the aura of plausible deniability. The plan coalesced in her mind like a design sketch: evidence presented publicly, under oath, unambiguous chain of custody, witnesses willing to testify to signatures, a ledger authenticated by the one true artifact that had always belonged to her mother, the bracelet. She would wear the bracelet to the public hearing where she would confront the deceitful mistress, the woman whose smile had been used to destroy her reputation, who sat like a painted thing at the front of the room with the composure of someone who had long ago learned how to act regretful while their hands were busy. The mistress, beautiful, polished, with a practiced hum of faux innocence, had insinuated herself into every vulnerable place. She had charmed the accountant, whispered to the cleaner, sat at the right table at the right time with a glass of something expensive. The first time Zhiwan confronted her privately, it was in a hotel corridor where the carpet smelled of damped roses. The mistress's outer thoughts were crisp with performance, a script about redemption and regret, a hope for protection from the men who used her. Her inner thought, however, was brittle. Protect me, hide it, sell the story, take the money, survive. Zhiwan listened and felt nothing except a profound tiredness for the way some women were weaponized and sold. You used my mother's name, Zhiwan said, with the authority of proof in hand. You ruined us. The woman's smile tightened. I did what I had to, she said aloud. Her inner world whispered angrily and with a self-serving clarity. They will pay me to stay quiet, keep me safe, and I will lie for them. I must eat. Zhiwan heard the plea like a child asking for bread. It was an ugly thing. Complicity disguised as desperation. Zhiwan could have exposed her then, taken the story, and broken the woman's life. Instead, she held the knowledge like a blade and put it away. There were legal paths and there were moral ones. She would choose the legal. She was not a woman who enjoyed ruin. She wanted justice. The public hearing was arranged like an arena. Camera lights burned, making everyone's cheeks look raw. The mistress sat with makeup adjusted to a perfection that suggested a profession, the art of seeming sorry. Mr. Wang watched from behind his lawyer with a smugness that irritated even the judge. Zhiwan stood in front of the court and laid out the chain of evidence like a seamstress aligning threads. The ledger, the clerk's testimony, the bank transfers, the discrepancy in timestamps. She produced the sketches, the fundamental blueprint, the margin notes in her mother's hand. And then, because the smallest things sometimes carry the heaviest weight, she unclasped the silver bracelet and placed it on the table. That bracelet, she said, was with my mother the night she signed the original patent application. Any copy without it is a lie. The room smelled of ink and something metallic. For a moment, truth was a thing that had weight. The cameras flashed. The mistress's inner voice, which had been a steady murmur of contingency, shifted into panic. The men behind her exchanged glances, like men considering whether to jump a sinking ship. The hearing did not end in a neat victory. The mistress cried, beautifully and theatrically, and the public split into two groups, those who believed Zhiwan and those who preferred a story with more color. But two things happened that mattered. First, the court issued a temporary injunction freezing certain assets, buying Zhiwan time. Second, a former associate of Mr. Wang, a man who had been paid off and hated himself, wrote a confession that dismantled the chain of custody of the forged documents. Truth, at last, began to assemble itself like a structure. There were consequences. Mr. Wang's men were arrested on separate charges related not to Zhiwan's case, but to an earlier extortion scheme. Qian Qian's social elevation cracked. The Xia family, protective of its image, softened its support. Li Chuan, exposed, fled the city with a few tarnished connections. Old Xia began a slow, shamed conversation with his daughters that smelled of apologies and old tobacco. These were not dramatic catharses. They were slow, bureaucratic shifts that rearranged power but did not erase pain. And yet, victory is always partial. At the end of the hearing, as reporters jostled for the best shot, Zhou Qi whispered something that made Zhiwan's breath stop. Someone powerful is still pulling strings. Her mind read the flicker on his face, not words, but the shadow of worry, an instinct to protect. She looked past the crowd and saw Xia Zhenting moving with a composed purpose. He had helped her, and he had his price. She suspected he had his own plan to profit from the chaos. A new layer of the game had been revealed. Even allies kept their options open. Even victories invited new battles. That night, on the scooter, beneath the rain-smeared lights, she felt the city's enormity press against them. She allowed herself a minute of tenderness before thinking of the ledger, of the files still missing, of the men who had escaped in that van. "We exposed them," Xochi said, steadying the scooter. "We exposed a part of them," she answered. "There are more lies. She swallowed. The power inside her, that strange, sharp access to other minds, buzzed faintly like a live wire. She knew, with a clarity that frightened her, that it would take more than a courtroom to unmake what had been done. It would take cunning, alliances, sacrifices she was still not sure she could make. Her mind flicked to the mistress who had sat weeping in court. She had been more victim than villain in some ways. She had been used, but she had also taken money that had been meant to be a bribe and had smiled while others suffered. The distinction mattered to Zhiwan, who had once been small and resentful and now wanted the law, not vengeance, to be the final arbiter. A week later, a break came in an unglamorous place, a coffee shop with peeling paint and an owner who remembered her mother as a woman who always paid her bills on time. A delivery driver, an ally they had barely noticed, handed Zhiwan an envelope. Inside were photographs, a ledger page, a photo of Qianchan in a meeting with Mr. Wang, a timestamp that contradicted the forged video by 2 days. "Who sent it?" Xochi asked. "Someone who didn't want to be seen," Zhiwan said. She felt the thought of the anonymous sender like a hand in the dark. It was a good thing, evidence arriving without fanfare. It meant more than one person had decided the truth was worth the risk. They began to coordinate exposures with a patience that felt like warfare. Notices were filed with the court, testimonies were prepared. A pattern emerged, one she could almost draw with a line. Mr. Wang's fixers had been paid to create a narrative that would sink Chungham, thereby allowing a consortium to buy the company at distress prices. The consortium's connection, of course, led back to an investment vehicle partially controlled by savvy associates. The corruption was a web. They were one steady hand starting to pull. It should have been enough. But power, as she had learned, is elastic. For every lie they stripped, another slithered into the place it had vacated. Qianchan, humiliated and on the brink of legal ruin, disappeared from social media. Rumors proliferated that she had been hospitalized for depression. People, quick to draw moral edges, whispered that she had been punished. Zhiwan found herself, in the quiet hours, feeling a complicated pity that tasted like acid. Qianchan's interior thoughts, when she could pry them loose with the dangerous tools she'd been given, were not simple malice. They were hunger and fear and the small human terror of a woman who had never known how to stop taking. Zhiwan had to remind herself that justice should not be cruelty draped as righteousness. And then, as if the world wanted to remind her that there were always new patterns to unpick, she received a text she could not ignore. The message was short: "We need you at the Wang estate tonight." It was unsigned, and of course it was a trap. But she also knew Mr. Wang was desperate. Desperation makes men careless. If she could bait him into an admission, if she could record a confession, she would finally have the legal hammer that would not only recover Chong Hong, but ensure the men who had attempted to take her life were held accountable. She went alone that night because she could trust only the proof of her own nerve. The Wang estate was a palace of faux class, chandeliers that did not match the art, a smell of lemon and arrogance. The mistress, who had by now shifted her allegiance like someone changing gloves, met Zhiwan in a library that smelled of dust and old paper. She looked exhausted. "I don't want to hurt anyone," the mistress whispered. "I only wanted to survive." "And you think aligning with men who hurt makes that survival not complicit?" Zhiwan replied. The mistress's thought popped. "If I confess, I will lose everything. If I don't, I will be used again. Which is worse?"
The choice was set like a coin on a table. Zhiwan knew that to push her to confession would be to cut a woman down to save many. The power in her head told her the woman's fear in granular detail, and that knowledge bowed her, manipulating people's deepest terrors, no matter how justified the cause, was an ethically dangerous road. Before she could decide, the library door banged open. Mr. Wang's fixer lunged, a shadow moving with the arrogance of men who feel they are owed the world. Hands on her. The room erupted into motion. A scuffle, a chair knocked, the exquisite chandelier shimmering like a cautionary bell. Zhou Qi crashed through the doorway then, a blue blur, a body that had not been invited into this plan, and yet had the right to defend. The fight ended in the way these things end. They were interrupted. Mr. Wang's men retreated into the night after a police car's headlights spilled across the drive. Someone had called it in. Perhaps it had been a neighbor, perhaps a friend, perhaps the mistress, finally deciding she could no longer profit from coordinated cruelty. In the aftermath, as they sat on the library steps and Zhiwan's bracelet clinked against her knee, Zhou Qi looked at her with a softness that shone harder than any chandelier. "You didn't have to do this alone," he said. "I did, and I didn't. I had you and the truth." He kissed her then, briefly and with the surety of someone whose hands had learned to be steady in storms. It was not theatrical, it was shelter. But the danger was not over. The very act of almost catching Mr. Wang and his accomplices had changed the terrain. Men who felt the heat of an encounter tightened the screws elsewhere. Qian Chen, who had vanished from social feeds, resurfaced in a scandal of a different sort. A leaked audio of her, not pleading but angry, promising retribution to those who had wronged her. The city turned the lens toward the scandal, and in doing so, missed the slow, legal pivot Zhiwan had set in motion: injunctions, asset freezes, the assembling of witnesses. And then came the whisper no one had expected. Xi Zhenting had been offered a deal to take over Changheng if he would decouple it from the district project and sell to a foreign investor who could bypass local scrutiny. The offer had a dark name attached to it. It suggested that the consortium had deep pockets and no scruples. Zhiwan sat with the news like a woman holding a hot coal, ready to use it but aware of the burn. She had one weapon left that felt both strange and perfectly suited to the moment: direct confrontation, using the mind reading to reveal not just lies but motives. She arranged a dinner at a neutral place, a private room in a restaurant that smelled of soy and citrus. Xi Zhenting arrived, composed as ever, with his grandmother's shadow folded into his posture like a cape. "I want to know what you want," Zhiwan said, without preamble. He smiled, that slow, practiced smile that could mean many things. "Stability," he said. His thought slipped. "I profit if the market is predictable. Power is less useful when it's noisy." "Name the price," she said. His eyes flicked, not to the money, but to her bracelet. "Trust," he said quietly, "and the assurance that my interests will not be second to your vendetta." She listened to the undercurrent. He feared the chaos a public trial could bring to the market. He feared reputational fallout. He wanted leverage. The question she asked, sounding small but precise, was one she had practiced in the mirror of memory. "And you'll help if the evidence is irrefutable?" His mind, always a careful room of locked drawers, opened the smallest of windows. He thought, "I will help if it benefits me." He was not generous. He was calculating. But he was not committed to Mr. Wang, not truly. "I might," he said, "but once we open doors, people we both want closed might get air. Are you prepared for that?" Zhiwan thought of old Shah, of the clerk, of Connie, of the men who had hurt them. She thought of Qian Chen's hollow hunger and wondered whether justice required the same sacrifice she had been willing to give. She had promised herself no murders, no annihilation, only accountability. "I am prepared," she said, and the words felt like stepping onto a bridge. They shook hands. Xi Zhenting left with a tie straightened. The alliance was brittle but usable.
As the weeks unfolded, momentum shifted. Evidence mounted in ways that could not be ignored. The court moved slowly, but it moved. The mistress, seeing the net tighten, did something unexpected. She met Zhiwan in private and told a truth none could have predicted. She revealed a file hidden beneath Mr. Wang's desk, a copy of a contract that directly implicated one of Xi Zhenting's trusted aides in forging signatures. She had kept it because she had wanted a bargaining chip. She traded it for safety. It was the chink in Xi Zhenting's armor. He lashed out, as men with much to lose do, and the crisis that followed was almost enough to undo everything Zhiwan had built. Political pressure mounted. Aboard the district project, voices rose against Changheng. The public, weary of complex corporate tales, began to slip back toward the theater of scandal. Chan Chan's fate became a subplot in tabloids. And in the background, like the hum of the city at night, the true threat emerged. A mysterious document that suggested someone in Zhiwan's own circle had been in league with Mr. Wang from the start. The revelation landed like a fist. Zhiwan scanned faces and found pain and loyalty and, buried somewhere, betrayal. She did not yet know who, but she had learned that memory was a compass and mind-reading a map. Now she had to walk the terrain. The path to full vindication would be long, it would be costly, and it would force her to choose what kind of leader she wanted to be, one who destroyed or one who rebuilt. On a rain-soaked morning, as the city prepared for another restless day, she stood at the window of her small office in a leased floor where the smell of printer toner and coffee was constant. The bracelet rested against her pulse. Zhou Qi stood behind her, quiet and present. "We can do this," he said. She clenched her jaw. "We will," she corrected, "but someone close to us betrayed us. Whoever it is, we'll find them," Zhou Qi finished. She let out a breath that was both a laugh and a prayer. Through the glass, the street glistened. People moved in their own stories, unaware of the legal maneuvers or the private wars being waged in boardrooms and bathrooms. Zhiwan turned toward the file on her desk, a neat stack of paper that smelled faintly of ink and hope. On top was a photograph, Chan at a banquet, smiling in that mercenary way a woman uses to cut through people's pity. Beside it, a scanned invoice. Beneath, a note in her mother's handwriting she had found months ago, a small directive about fairness that Zhiwan had once thought naive and now loved for its stubborn insistence on goodness. She touched the bracelet and thought of the woman who had worn it through hard winters and small triumphs. She felt a strange power in her chest, the gift of a mind that could read others, yes, but also the ability to read herself. She knew now that the truest test of leadership would be whether she could wield her gifts without becoming the thing she had sworn to unmake. Outside, the city breathed, full of betrayals and chances. Inside, Xia Zhiwan read the minds of her enemies when she needed to and saved mercy for those with reasons that could be heard like brittle confessions. She would bring Mr. Wang down. She would expose the deceitful mistress and secure her mother's legacy. She would become a CEO who used intelligence, not cruelty. And yet, as she moved through the stack of papers, a single line of text skittered across her phone screen like an ominous ripple. "Watch the hearing tomorrow, or else." The message was unsigned. The threat was thin as paper, but she had learned that paper could cut deep. Her bracelet felt like a small sun in her hand. She read the message again and, for the first time since memory returned, allowed herself to be afraid, not of the men outside, but of the fact that the war had only just reshaped into a new battlefield. She looked at Zhou Qi. He read her like she wanted to be read, not with pity, but with the steady confidence of someone who would ride the scooter into danger with her. "We prepare," he said. "We prepare," she agreed,
And at that moment, across the city, men whose livelihoods were built on the abuse of power hurried to do the same. The next hearing would not be merely judicial. It would be a spectacle. It would decide not only the fate of Cheng Hong, but the shape of the alliances she had built and the lines she had drawn. Zhiwan stood, straightening the collar of the jacket that had never meant anything to her until it became armor. She felt the mind reading like a new sense at the edge of a fight, a thing to be used carefully, like a scalpel. She had a list of people she trusted, a map of those she suspected, and a hand on the nearest truth. Tonight, she would sleep for a few hours and dream of ink and ledger lines. Tomorrow, she would walk into a room full of lights and faces and force the world to look where she pointed. She would confront the deceitful mistress, not with vengeance alone, but with evidence so clear it could not be danced around. The city darkened, lights splintering across wet pavement. In a room above the street, Zhiwan sat with a bracelet and a file and a man who loved her in a steady, unflashy sort of way. She closed her eyes and heard for a brief second the tangled chorus of other people's motives: jealousy, greed, fear, survival, like a choir she had come to lead. She opened her eyes and, with the measured calm of someone who had been born twice and refused to be born small again, stepped into the night. They took a taxi that moved through a city still damp from the rain, the headlights painting pale streaks across the bracelet at her wrist. But beneath it, there was something else, a current too deliberate to be coincidental, a leak, an inside hand moving in the dark. Her attention, sharpened, skimmed the crowd and found it in the least likely quarter, a quiet woman at the back who catalogued the proceedings like a librarian. Her thought, when it brushed Zhiwan's mind, was almost clinical. I make notes so they make fewer mistakes. The woman wore a badge that identified her as part of the judge's staff. Zhao Qi leaned in. "You see something?" "A hand," Zhiwan whispered, "not from Qian Qian's camp, from inside." He straightened at that, a small, precise movement. "Then we have to force a paper trail. Make the leak visible. No guesses in this room." Li Na nodded and adjusted strategy. She called for an exhibit to be entered into evidence that would show a chain of custody. That document, innocuous on its face, contained an alteration so neat it had almost escaped them. Zhiwan had found it last night in the ledger, a line erased and rewritten in a different hand. She felt the presence of the person who had touched the page. They had done it with the hesitant care of someone trying to protect a reputation more than themselves. Outside the immediate tangle of law, Mr. Wang watched the proceedings from the front row like a man at a theater. He did not appear to need to move. He preferred to let others do the labor of distortion. Beside him, Qian Qian's smile was a blade hidden in silk. The hearing moved forward. Witnesses sworn, statements read, the mechanical language of rules. Then, as Li Na rose for cross-examination, a commotion rippled through the gallery. Phones lifted. A woman in the second row stood and pointed at the rear of the courtroom. "Security," someone called. Heads turned. The judge paused, brow tightening. A clerk hurried past. A folded piece of paper, crisp and white, lay on the wood near Zhiwan's counsel table, as if it had been delivered by a hand that knew exactly where to place it. She did not remember a messenger. She did not need to open it to feel its meaning. The handwriting wavered between familiarity and threat. Her mouth tasted of metal. Zhao Qi's fingers brushed hers under the table. "Open it," he mouthed. She unfolded the paper. 4 words in a precise, looping hand. "Do not name her." The gallery fell into a hush as Li Na began her questioning. But for Zhiwan, the room had narrowed to the single, impossible command on that scrap: "Do not name her." Who was the her? Chan, the woman from the judge's staff, someone else? The instruction was not just a warning, it was a map with a missing corner. She looked up and found the quiet woman at the back watching them, eyes empty as a caught lake. The woman's hands folded around a pen as if she had been writing notes. Zhiwan read the thought that flickered like a reflection. We are necessary. It was not a confession. It was an argument. Li Na's voice pulled her back to the present.
Do you recognize this signature? Lena asked, holding up the altered ledger. The private investigator swiveled, ready to defend his findings. Qian's lawyer began to speak, rehearsed outrage on his face. The judge listened like a conductor deciding whether to end a symphony. Zhiwan slid the scrap into her palm and let the edges press into her skin. The hearing was a game of light and shadow. Someone had dropped a shadow into the center of the table. She realized then that the war had become subtler than she'd imagined. It no longer wanted to destroy her by force. It wanted to corrode what she trusted from within. And the worst part, the part that made her stomach lurch, was how many hands might be holding the paper that would make that corrosion permanent. She stood and pushed the paper toward Lena. "Question the clerk," she said quietly. "Request the communication logs for this morning. Demand the chain of custody for every document entered by the court. No exceptions." Lena's eyes sharpened. "I'll move now." As the judge nodded and the legal machinery shifted to accommodate yet another flurry of motions, Zhiwan felt the bracelet at her wrist as if it were a pulse against the night. The scrap's words rippled beneath her fingers like a threat and a dare. Outside the courtroom doors, a man in a dark coat watched them leave. He had the posture of someone who recorded small betrayals like inventory. He smiled then, but it was not the kind of smile that reached the eyes. Zhiwan met his gaze, and for a sliver of a second, she believed she recognized him. He belonged to a different life, a recurring minor detail she had glimpsed in photographs and in the edges of other people's stories. Her mind brushed his ought and found it cold and clean. I keep accounts. She did not yet have the proof. She had the taste of the proof and a scrap that told her what not to say. The hearing continued without interruption, but for Zhiwan, the room had become a chessboard with one knight missing. When the recess was called and the press surged for statements, she drew Zhao Qi close and whispered, "We find the accounts. We make every hand visible." He nodded. "We do it without naming names," he said. She wondered for a moment if that was possible. They stepped back into the light, and the city seemed to hold its breath with them. The next move would determine what the world saw and what it allowed to remain hidden. The game had just changed its rules, and Zhiwan felt the sharp, dangerous pleasure of a new round beginning.